Author Tube channel. My name is Bobbi Holmes and I am the USA Today Bestselling Author of the Paranormal Cozy Mystery Series, Haunting Danielle. And I also write under the pen name Anna J. McIntyre. Well, 2 days ago I released the 25th book in my Haunting Danielle series, The Ghost of a Memory. And so that's one reason why my videos have been coming out like every couple weeks or week and a half or so. I've been writing and publishing. But today I wanted to put out a video on self-publishing. As I've mentioned in previous videos, there are two aspects of being a self-published author. One is the writer's hat that you wear, and the other one is the self-publishing hat that you have to wear. Well, for me, my interest started with the writing side of the equation. But today I'm going to be talking about the self-publishing side and how I started in self-publishing. The title of today's video is Publishing a Cookbook, because for me, that's where self-publishing began. So let's turn back the clock to 1982, because that's when self-publishing began for me, and it all started with a cookbook. Now, in 1982, we were not familiar with the term desktop publishing. What really started off the desktop publishing era was a software program called Adobe PageMaker that wasn't released until 1985. But in 1982, I wanted to publish a cookbook, and this is why. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, had passed away a few years before, and when she died, I had in my possession all of her recipe cards. Now, I really wasn't sure who I was going to give them to because I felt they belonged to the entire family, but I had them in my possession. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with them. And then about a year or so later, my paternal grandmother died, and my sister and I were her only grandchildren, and so we ended up with all of her recipe cards too, and recipe files. And so I decided that I wanted to self-publish a cookbook, not for public distribution, but for the family, where I would put all the recipes from my grandmother's in one cookbook and then print it out and give it to all my cousins and relatives and close friends. And I thought that would be a nice way to share grandma's recipes, and I just didn't really feel that I should keep all the recipes for myself. It just didn't seem right. So I began testing the recipes. I was a stay-at-home mom at that time. Our son was about 3 years old, and I think I probably started this whole project when I was pregnant with my daughter Elizabeth, but I finished it when she was just an infant. So I started testing the recipes, and I really did have to test them, and the reason is why is my grandmother, for example, she had lots of cookie recipes, but she would just have the ingredients listed. She didn't say like how to prepare them, how to mix them up, or what temperature to cook them on, or how long to cook them. So I would look for other similar cookie recipes and regular established cookbooks and try to cook them about the same way, and when they turned out, then I would rewrite the recipes, so I would use her ingredients, but the instructions so anybody could make the cookie. And she had some great bread recipes. Until that time I had never been able to make good bread, homemade bread. In fact, once we made it for some friends, and I made this loaf of bread, and it literally turned out like a brick. It was as heavy as a brick, and but it looked beautiful, so I wrapped it up in this tea towel, and I took it over to our neighbor. I knocked on the door and go, "Here's some fresh bread for you." It was pretty funny because it was really bad. But my grandma's recipes were amazing, and I was able to make her recipes and do some wonderful bread, so I put those in the recipe book. Now, the only thing that I didn't kitchen test were the jellies. I was a little nervous, and so when I typed those up, I put little asterisks by them, and then that told the person reading the cookbook that those were untested recipes, where all the ones that didn't have the asterisks, they had been tested. So since there were no printers around back then that you could just print, I only didn't want to print like 1,000 copies or anything. I wanted maybe, I don't know, probably 50 books or something for all my different cousins and close friends. So what I did is I typed up the cookbook. It wasn't typeset like a printer would use back in those days. It was on a typewriter. And then when I did the layout, I was going to lay it out on ledger-sized paper. Actually, this, like I said, this is the final book, and so as you can see, it was originally on ledger-sized paper, and then it was cut like that. And I was living up in Wrightwood, California at the time, and my father brought his copy machine from work when he came to visit, and I remember laying out, the pages. I typed it all out, and I printed it out, and they were like on a half size, the smaller like piece of papers, and then I laid them on the copy machine, and then we printed them out on the ledger paper. And then we had a paper cutter that he also brought that I borrowed, and I cut them in half, and then I put them in order. And we took them down to an office supply, and we put in the comb binding, and we made a little book. When putting together the book, I used what I had learned in my college courses on layout and design and how to put together a book with the different pages and the signatures and all that sort of thing. So that's what I did with this, and I did it like a regular book where I had the title page. And back in those days, since we didn't have desktop publishing, the letters here were those little rub-on letters. I don't know if you remember those. I imagine they still make them, but now you can print off everything off the computer. So I called it Great Grandma's Recipe Book. And another thing I did, I decided I wanted to publish this under a publisher name. So for those of you familiar with my publishing name, it's Robeth Publishing. You might think, well, where did you get that? Well, it started with this cookbook. And like I said, my daughter was a newborn at the time, because this book came out in 1982. I believe I published it in December 1982 because I gave it to all my friends and family at Christmas time. It was Christmas gifts that I gave everybody. And Elizabeth was actually born in August. So I know that this particular book came out after August and before Christmas, because that's when I put it together and gave it out, because I named my publishing company Robeth Publishing. As you can see right there, Robeth Publishing. I don't know if you can see that, Robeth Publishing. And Robeth Publishing is a combination of my children's name. Our son is Robert Scott, so the Robeth from the Robert part, and Elizabeth is our daughter, so the Beth from her, so Robeth is from Robert and Elizabeth. And that's maybe be a little corny, but that name since 1982 has been the publishing house that I've, my own publishing house that I have operated under. So actually the very first self-publishing endeavor, a project that I did, was for myself and my family and my friends. It wasn't something that I, produced and then went out and tried to sell. It was something just for our family. So this is the last one that I have left. Obviously I gave a bunch of them away, so they may or may not still have them. The ones that I had sort of fell apart. This was my mom's, the ones that she had, so I'm trying to save this one so it doesn't fall apart. But this is an example of my very first self-published cookbook. Now, after my self-published cookbook, which was a personal project for family and friends, I then went on and published a community magazine in Southern California for Wrightwood Field in Pinion Hills, California. It was a monthly publication. I ran it for a number of years until I had to move back to Havasu to take over my parents' business when my dad became ill. So Robeth Publishing then became the publishing house that I published under when I had my community magazine. So the next cookbook that I self-published wasn't really a cookbook per se. It was a history book with a cookbook thrown into it. And it was Where the Road Ends, Havasu Palms, Recipes and Remembrances. Now by this time we were living in Havasu Palms. We had taken over my parents' business. In fact, I have a YouTube video about Havasu Palms. If you're curious, you can check that out and learn a little bit more about it. Now at this time, it was 1995. My father had passed away a few years before. We were managing the resort. And I wanted to put together a book of history about the park that I was planning to sell locally or in the store at Havasu Palms. And in order to bring the tenants in and make them feel like they were more involved in the project, I asked them to donate some recipes. The Havasu Palms is a mobile home park, and the people down there, most of them, it's vacation homes for them. They don't live there. Some of them do, the retired people. But most of the people, it's a vacation home for them. And so at the very back of the book, to kind of explain what I did, Where the Road Ends, Havasu Palms, Recipes and Remembrances also contains over 150 recipes donated by the people who have themselves added flavor and character to the place where the road ends. And so they gave me some great recipes, and I put them in the back of the book. But I didn't do what I did with Great Grandma's recipe book. With this particular one, I wasn't about to print it off on the printer and comb bind it. That really wasn't where I was going for. So back in those days, in 1995, the only kind of printers that you could use was like a vanity printer. So I decided to use Morris Publishing, which was a printer that specialized in cookbooks. And it was usually charity cookbooks. So let's say you had a church and you wanted to put together recipes of your congregation, but you really, didn't know how to, put together a cookbook and self-publish, and then you would work with Morris Publishing, and they would do a lot of the work for you when they would put it together. And sometimes they had special deals where, you wouldn't pay for it up front. You would go out and, sell the cookbooks, and then, you'd pay them afterwards. They had all kinds of different things for charities back in those days. But when I was using them, I kind of took a little different route. I wanted to be more in control on how the book looked. So I didn't use any of their artwork or their layout, and I really did it all myself, and then they just, printed the book. So I used them more like a printer. So this particular book, I had printed up a bunch of copies. It wasn't a print-on-demand situation where print one book at a time. So back in those days, for this type of a printer, I can't remember how many I had printed up. Now, a bunch of them we sold to the store, and we sold through tenants. I sell this book at the local museum. Currently, I sell what copies I have left on Amazon, and then I just mail them out to people when they order them. It's not a huge seller anymore because it is local history. But that's how this particular book came around. Now, actually, I did make my money back on this, and I didn't get rich or anything, but I did make some sort of a profit on it. We sold a lot of them back then. I have a few left now that, like I say, I sell online through Amazon, but it's not, I don't have an ebook on it, and it was not print on demand where you just print one at a time. It was like a whole batch. So when these are gone, they're gone, unless I turn it into an ebook, which I really doubt that I will. The last book I self-published as a recipe book was Recipe Traditions from Our Family to Yours. Now, this one really kind of shows a progression on self-publishing. Now, if you'll remember, my very first book that I showed you that I did was done on a copy machine. The next book was done pretty much at a vanity publishing or printer, but it was the one that specialized in cookbooks. Now, this particular book, on this one, I used a print and demand, and it was done at Lulu, which was relatively new back then. I believe it was probably the very first print on demand publishing, or at least well-known one at that time. Now, I have to look at my notes. This particular book I published in 2005, and it was not really done to sell at stores or anything like this. This was very similar to my very first project. It was for family members, and was done for a Christmas gift. Now, Lulu had come around like about 3 years earlier. I was familiar with Lulu because I taught a class at our local community college on self-publishing through Lulu, and I've done a number of projects with them that were more personal projects for family or for Christmas gifts, not really to try to sell to the general public. So for me, a lot of my early self-publishing over the years has been more or less for personal, kind of an arts and craft or homemade type of project. So on this particular book, the recipes in it were from the very first recipe book I ever put out, the one from my great-grandma's recipe book, the recipes from both my grandparents and some of my great-grandparents, and also recipes from our family restaurant because we ran a restaurant for a number of years. So I took some of the recipes from our restaurant and some from the grandmother, and I put this particular book together for family and friends. And one funny thing about the cover that I will mention, now I took this particular picture and I wanted to use it because the china was my mother's china, and I kind of wanted to work in the family thing as for Christmas gift. But the bad thing is I did not have a recipe for a cream puff in the book. So it was really a silly picture for me to put on my cookbook, considering there was no cream puff in there. So if I was to sell this online, which I'm not, people would go, oh, there's no cream puff in here. What's the picture there? So that's one of my little strange things about this one. So another thing about this book is when ebooks first came out at Amazon, this file, just for the heck of it, was the first one that I ever self-published as an ebook. I took the file that I used for this one and I uploaded it and created an ebook. I think I've mentioned that in a previous video before. I did, maybe made 10 bucks on it or something over the years, who knows, but I have since removed it. So this was the third cookbook, and once again, this was done really more for a personal project, but it was self-publishing. And it also shows how, like I said, how self-publishing has evolved over the years. The very first one was something I did on a copy machine back in the 80s. And then the next one was something I did at a vanity publisher, which Morris was, but they specialized more in cookbooks. And then the last one was done at Lulu, which was one of the very early print-on-demand for self-publishers. Now, I had intended to self-publish a fourth cookbook, and this is the cover. I'll be putting it up because I never did the book. And I had this particular cover designed by my daughter, Elizabeth, who is a professional cover designer, and she designs all my covers now. But I never got around to finishing the book, and I'm not sure I will. And one reason is, well, this is kind of not the era anymore for cookbooks. I mean, we've got Pinterest. So if I was to do a cookbook, I would really need to include photographs, because who wants to look at a cookbook nowadays that don't have really nice pictures of the recipes? So this is kind of like a book I've always thought about doing, but I probably won't ever do. But I do think that self-publishing a cookbook can be really a fun project for you as a family, like for family reunions, or if you have special recipes that you want to pass down to your kids, your grandkids. It doesn't have to be a project that you go out and sell to stores or even online or whatever, but it is something that some of you out there might be interested in, and you have a lot more options now. You don't have to use the copy machine and the typewriter like I did back in 1982. You don't have to use something like Morris like I did back in the 90s, when I had to have like probably 1,000 or more copies printed, so that was a lot more money up front. Nowadays you can use something more of a print on demand, where you can just do as many books as you need and not have to have a big run. So that pretty much wraps it up for today. So I hope all of you out there are staying safe, and if you plan to write and publish your own cookbook or your book of poetry or whatever you are planning to do, I wish you luck, and be grateful that we live in this era where you don't have to use a typewriter and a copy machine anymore to get the job done, or take it down to the local stationery store to have it spiral bound. And I hope all of you are doing well in this crazy, crazy time, and to the authors out there, write on.